Hello everyone, and today we will discuss about HTTP and observables here in Angular. HTTP and observables. It is a very important concept here in Angular, and they are often used together to make network requests and handle the responses. HTTP is a protocol used for communicating between the client and the server over the internet. Angular provides a built-in HTTP client module that allows you to make HTTP requests from your application. The HTTP client module returns an observable that you can subscribe in order to receive the response from the server. Observables are a powerful concept here in Angular that allows you to work with asynchronous data streams. Observables can emit multiple values over time and can be transformed using operators. They can also be combined with other observables to create complex data streams. When making an HTTP request in Angular, you typically create an observable using the HTTP client module, which will emit the response from the server. You can then subscribe to this observable to receive the response and handle it as needed. So here are examples of HTTP methods here in Angular. HTTP requests are typically made using the HTTP client. The HTTP client supports various HTTP methods that can be used to interact with the server. And first, GET. This is used to retrieve data from a server, and this method is commonly used to read data from a server. Post, used to submit data to a server to create a new resource. This method is commonly used to create a new resource on the server. So basically, in get, this is what we used in getting the JSON data on our country's example last time. And the post method in HTTP can be used by submitting the method and when the user is finished filling up his information for registration, we can basically send the data to the API using the post method. Put, used to update an existing resource on the server, and this method replaces the entire resource with the new data. Basically, it overrides the data or the current data that you're um, specifying in the method, wherein patch is used to update an existing resource on the server, and this method is similar to put, but it only updates the specified properties of the resource. Basically, patch is almost the same as put, but we can update a specific data in our API, and of course, delete, and this is used to delete a resource from the server. And I'll show you some examples for the HTTP methods in Angular. So first is get. Um, Basically, in this example, we are just basically using the method get data that uses HTTP client module to make an HTTP get request to the um, to the URL that we specified, which is the endpoint, and the get method returns an observable that emits the response from the server. This observable can be then subscribed in order to handle responses. And overall, HTTP and observables are important concepts in Angular that are often used together to make network requests and handle the response in a reactive and efficient manner. Then, next is the post method or the post request. In this example, we are using HTTP client to make an HTTP post request to the URL which serves as the endpoint, and then we will create a body containing the data that we want to send in the request body, and an object with the label or the name of headers, or the const variable headers containing the content type to set the data into application slash JSON format. We then use the post method to make the request, passing in the endpoint URL or the request body and the headers as options. We then subscribe to the observable that is returned by the post method and log the response data to the console. Note that in this example, we are setting the content type to application slash JSON, and this is because we are sending JSON data in the request body. If you were sending some other forms of data, you would set the content type header to the format of the data that you want. So basically, it's application slash the format that you wanted instead of using the JSON format. And then next is the put request as an example. Basically, in this example, we are still using the HTTP client to make an HTTP put request to the URL or the API that we're using, or it serves as the endpoint. And then we also will create a object labeled body containing the data that we want to send in the request body, and an object called headers containing the content type to set the application slash JSON data format. We then use the method or the HTTP method put to make the request, passing in the endpoint URL, the request body, and the headers as options. We then subscribe to the observable that is returned by the put method and log the response data to the console. But note that in this example, we are only just again setting the content type header to application slash JSON. And because we are sending JSON data in the request body, and if you were sending any other forms of data, you would set the content type header to application slash the format of the JSON data that you want. Also, you have to take note that we are updating the resource with the ID of 1. As you can see in the URL, it's JSON placeholder.typicode.com slash 1. Basically, we are changing or updating the data inside the resource with a ID of 1. And in a real world application, you would likely have a way to dynamically determine which resource to update based on user input or other factors. Then next is the HTTP patch request. Basically, in this example again, we are using HTTP client to make an HTTP patch request to the URL that we're using as the endpoint. We then will again create a body containing the data that we want to send in the request body, and an object called headers containing the content type header that is set to application slash JSON. And then we use the patch method to make the request, passing in the endpoint URL or the request body and the header as the options. We then subscribe to the observable that is returned by the patch method and log the response to the data and log the response data to the console. Note that in this example, we are setting the content type header to application slash JSON again. This is because we are sending JSON data in the request body. And again, if you want to change the format of the data that you're sending, you may change the content type into application slash um, the data type that you want to send. And note again that we are updating the resource with ID of 1. And again, you can also create a different ways on how to um, update or specify the resource with an ID, or maybe some other data using some maybe property binding, so that you can get the data from the user input, or maybe the two-way binding, or etc. And then lastly, the delete method. In this example, again, we are using the HTTP client to make an HTTP request called delete to the endpoint URL. And then again, we will create a headers containing the content type header set to application slash JSON. And then we will use the delete method to make the request, passing in the endpoint URL and the headers as the options. After subscribing to the observable that is returned by the delete method, and log the response data to the console. Basically, the console here will show a null array that contains no data anymore, because we use already the delete method. And simply note that in this example, we are not sending data in the request body, so we do not need to create a body object. Also note that we are deleting the resource with ID of 1, and in the real live in a real live application, you will likely have some other ways on how to specify this a resource depending to the user input, or maybe a user that's logged in your application. And that's it for the HTTP and observables. In the next following videos, I'll show you some examples on how um, and on how to use these methods in different ways, or maybe dynamically use it and give a user input in order to delete something. That would be all. Thank you.